welcome back. I am here today to sit down and explain a little bit about the behavior cycle that I work with people who have acted out in harmful ways. And this can be in anything: yelling at someone, violence, anger issues, and those who have sexually harmed others. So these are all part of the scope of my practice that I work with individuals around. I also work with people who have been harmed, and a lot of the times I also think that going over this behavior cycle, one, because it can apply to all of us. It can apply to any behavior that you don't want to repeat, so it's applicable. And for a lot of people who've been harmed by others, they want to know why. Why did this person do this to me? And I will also go over this cycle so that they can understand that. So I'm going to put up the image in a couple of different places. So we'll cut out from me and you'll see the image. We're going to start up at the top. So we have releasing conditions. This is simply life happening around us. So we have certain vulnerabilities. So check out my vulnerability and resiliency video if you haven't already. We just have vulnerabilities. And then we have triggers from things that have happened, either with this person or the situation or other events in our life that's created overwhelm for us. So we want to consider these things, and we want to think of them in a way where these things are going to happen. Very rarely do we get to control all the circumstances, and really never do we have control of others. So it's really important to know what these causes and conditions are for you so that you can be looking out for them. One of the things that I talk about after we go over a cycle with someone are the off-ramps. So I'm going to include some of those in here during our discussion. So if you imagine these gaps in between each section. So if we want to stay out of continuing a cycle, at this point, it's really about being aware and engaging our mindfulness. So the more mindful we can be in any given situation, the more we can be aware of our particular brand of vulnerabilities, stressors, triggers, we can accommodate or know, hey, this might be happening, so let me get my resources ready for that. Of course, things pop up unexpectedly, so there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to do that all the time. But the more you practice mindfulness and awareness, the more you're going to have that readily available when any of these causes and conditions pop up. The next phase then is going to be our emotions, and specifically our responses to these triggers, to these causes and conditions that are popping up. So our brain works in microseconds, and a lot of things can happen in a short amount of time, our emotions being one. So we are kind of hardwired to experience something and then have a reaction right after it. And can be really, really challenging for people who get really triggered, who have a lot of stressors, who have experienced a lot of negative events in their life. And so what I try to explain here is that it's more important to know what your automatic, most go-to emotional responses are and what they look like for you, so that, again, you can be more aware faster and more efficient in how you deal with them. So a lot of things can look like anxiety, fear, overwhelm, feeling like a failure, feeling shame. These are all the reactions to whatever those vulnerabilities and triggers are in that first step. So what we want to do here in the off-ramp would be, again, mindfulness, awareness, and having some kind of capacity or threshold to sit with our emotions, to recognize these are feelings and they're here to tell me something. Let me pay attention to that and let me go inward for a minute and deal with what's happening inside of me so that I don't go into an automatic response or reaction. If we're not able to do that, we go then to the third part of the cycle, which is the distortions. If you are a living, breathing human being, then I hate to break this to you, but you have distortions. We all have them, and we, again, usually have a particular brand of them that feel well rehearsed. One of the ways that I describe this to people is some phrasing that came from Brene Brown around what are the stories that we're telling ourselves. So often we have these well-rehearsed, well-conditioned storylines. Some of them didn't even come from us. They came from when we were little and something that was well-rehearsed and brought to us. So sometimes we don't even realize what's going on in the backdrop. And that is where, again, that awareness and mindfulness can help you start to break up the idea. But often, even in my own life, I will catch myself like, what am I telling myself? Why am I having this discussion in my head right now? Or why is this pretend conversation going on inside of my head? Like, this is not effective. So it's really important to recognize that, again, it's part of just being human. It happens pretty automatically. You're going to have something happen. You're going to have an emotional response. You're going to start to have thoughts around that experience of all of that. And so it's not to control the thoughts. It's to notice where your thoughts have gone and what are the stories you're telling yourself, and are they effective? Are they putting fuel on top of a fire? Or are they helping you understand yourself more and understand what your experience is so that you can better handle it and manage it with skillful means? So this is kind of the make it or break it moment in the cycle, because these are automatically just happening in the backdrop. And if at any moment we can cut it off at this point and be aware of it at this point, we're doing really well. The next part, which is the first quadrant of this cycle, is our avoidance and our isolation. So this can look and break down a lot of different ways for individuals, but the way I kind of describe it to people is we look at avoidance and isolation as either something you're actively avoiding and isolating from. So you are taking conscious effort of like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to have this conversation. I'm not going to use effective skills and go put a boundary here with this situation or this person, or it's not worth the energy. So I'm just going to pretend this doesn't bother me. Those are all active ways of avoiding and isolating ourselves. Passive ways are maybe we don't feel like anyone can understand us. Maybe we have been shut down so many times by other people or been betrayed by people that we have put our confidence in that it doesn't even feel worth making the effort. We have tried to reach out to people and just no one is available in that moment. So we actually feel physically isolated, or we feel like we don't have the resources to handle what's going on in this moment. All of that can be a reality. The other piece of this, though, is that when we emotionally avoid and isolate what's actually happening within us, and we don't utilize our resources, or maybe we have caused some kind of situation in our own life where our resources are disconnected from us in that moment, like we've gotten in a fight with someone and so we don't feel like we can reach out to them. What happens is then we could even be in a room full of people but feel alone and isolated and really shut down and avoidant. So this is going to be your particular brand of what you try to avoid, or what your avoidance tactics are when you're feeling isolated, and what that's really about. You're really trying to look at that, because what starts to happen at this point in the cycle is that all of this stuff is happening inside of you, and instead of going inward and instead of understanding what's happening for you, you kind of double down on this idea of not dealing with this, and it's not my problem, or just using outright denial. There is nothing there to even discuss or deal with. And that doesn't mean that it's gone. That whole out of sight, out of mind thing is a illusion and a trick that we play on ourselves, because it's in our bodies, and it's in our subconscious mind, and it's in everything else that's playing out around us in that moment. It's still there. We are just choosing to actively or passively avoid those circumstances. So far in this cycle, what we're looking at is the inward process of what's going on around us in the beginning. We can get internally triggered, but a lot of the times that's happening because there's things going on around us. So far in this process, though, it's all been an inside job. It's all of the stuff happening inside of you. So this next step is, because it's a pretty miserable place to be sitting. Like, something feels triggering. We are not becoming aware of it. We're letting our emotions build up. We're telling ourselves a story that, like, here we go again. This is hopeless. This is helpless. I don't have any resources. Nobody will understand me. I'm willfully just not going to do things that could be helpful. Not a place where most of us want to stay. And so what happens is that, again, we don't turn inward, so we're turning outward. And this is a very simple part of the process, which is just the externalization of all of that. So instead of looking inward, instead of realizing what's going on, and this isn't to say that you don't want to uphold boundaries or make requests or communicate something because someone is doing something, or there's a circumstance that you're feeling uncomfortable with. That can all be really valid. However, not dealing with our own stuff first and then taking the effective steps that can get us out of a cycle means that we're externalizing. So it's, if only that person wasn't doing this thing, I wouldn't feel so horrible. If only these circumstances weren't happening around me, I wouldn't have to be so anxious. I wouldn't have to feel so alone. And again, these are really ingrained and well-rehearsed and well-conditioned responses. And so we just simply only look outside of ourselves. We're only at this stage being like, well, it's something out there. We're not considering what our part of our responsibility for our own emotions and thoughts and conditions might be. So then that externalization turns very quickly into blame and angry feelings. So just a side note, when I do anger management, anger is a secondary emotion. So all those first emotions, frustration, fear, shame, all of that stuff that's happening in that second step, now we would start to feel anger feelings. We start to feel blame towards the situation, towards the people that, again, we feel powerless and out of control. And part of that is because we've given away our power and control by not taking our ownership of, like, oh wow, okay, I'm having these feelings, I'm having this reaction, I'm having these thoughts because this thing that this person said really upset me. I need to get curious about that. I need to figure out what is actually happening for me, and are there any steps that I need to take to make that situation a little bit better? or get out of it, or not have to continue to feel hurt in this way. So we get into a power and control cycle, and the domestic violence, power and control violence wheel can help direct us in some ways. But I find that that's pretty on the extreme end for a lot of people. A lot of this just looks like not giving in, trying to maybe be defiant or resistant in our own way, trying to be willful, so trying to put our expectations out in the process and say, I'm not dealing with anything that's not this. So again, these are what I would call less effective tactics that really don't get us where we want to be. And it's coming from that externalization process. We're still only focused on out there. We aren't turning inward and saying like, wow, I'm feeling really powerless and out of control. And the way out of this is, where's my empowerment? What can I control? And it might honestly be in that moment. I can control my posture. I can control my breath. I can control what I choose to do next. It very rarely is that we get to control the situation or the person. And the empowerment is, okay, by focusing on what I can control, then my empowerment for myself, or maybe trying to empower others around me, how is that going to pay off for me and get me out of this negative feeling, negative feedback loop? So a lot of people kind of do like a miniature cycle here where, you're feeling all of this, you continue to isolate and avoid, you continue to externalize, you feel more anger and power and control, struggle, and kind of just cycle through that. When we shift towards moving forward in the cycle, if we haven't come to terms with, okay, what do I have empowerment around and what can I control? We move into imagination. We start to imagine scenarios. We have fantasies. The day without consequences is how I usually describe it, of like, I could go off on my boss and I could quit my job and I could do all these things. We start to play that out. So this is sort of a continuation of the stories we've told ourselves, but now we're kind of projecting this into the future. We're projecting into the like, what would we want to do if we could get away with it? And sometimes it really honestly is just, if we're in a fight and we're standing in a kitchen and someone else is in the living room, we're sitting there imagining all of the things that we're going to say when we go back into that other room, or what we would want to say, because we're angry and we feel powerless and out of control, and we're going to regain our power by being adamant about something or shouting back about something. The strategies here again are, look at that, pay attention, wait, how did I get here? How am I imagining this? How am I having an imaginary conversation that's not happening right now? And start to bring that awareness into that moment. When we don't do that, another quality of that process is that we're dehumanizing someone. So I use that word simultaneously with objectification. When we see people as objects or as less than, and that can be a lot of things. We can be devaluing them. We can think that our suffering is greater than their suffering, so we have more of a right to say these things to someone. When we're there, we often start to shift into this planning mode. And planning, again, can be as simple as just making the decision to act. For a lot of us, if we're in any kind of contemplation stage of this, like, there has to be a really strong motivator to make it more impulsive, to make it feel like that urge to act, and the impulse to act has to be pretty strong for us to not really be thinking anything through. And the internal inhibitions, so our natural stop signs in our brain, sort of have to get around those by saying, again, it's okay because my suffering's greater, or they're not a very good person, because very good people don't say or do these things to begin with. I wouldn't be triggered. I wouldn't feel this way if this person hadn't made me feel this way. So in that moment, we're dehumanizing them. We're not empathizing with their humanity. We're not giving them compassion. We are demonizing them, and start to plan ahead of, yeah, I am going to go in there and say these things because I deserve that. I have every right to, because they're no good, awful, subhuman being. And we may not say that out loud to ourselves, but there's kind of a theme there around that. We can't simultaneously be feeling empathy for someone and also decide to scream and yell at them. Opposite sides of the spectrum. This leads us to the things that we know we shouldn't be doing. The yelling, the screaming, the lying, the sneaking, the abusing, you name it. It's the things that we don't want to do. The things that we even do to ourselves. Maybe we're not acting out towards anyone else. It's the using the substances. It's the using food as a drug, as not intended for nutritional value. It's self-harming. Whatever it looks like for you, it's there. And we all have it. We all have a cycle. Some people's cycles are more destructive than others, sure. But we're all human, so we all have this. But in this place, accountability, putting into question, pausing, really doing a gut check of like, if I say this, what are the potential consequences? So consequential thinking of, how could I impact this person? Or how could I impact other people? How is this short-term urgency of getting rid of this feeling going to impact me long-term? And sometimes this is not the part of the cycle that we can do that. We needed to do that earlier. At this point, everything is adrenaline, and we might even be disassociated at this point. We're so dysregulated, so we're just pushing forward without really thinking at all. So then we act out. Even when we do the things that we know we shouldn't be doing, we can be accountable in that moment. Oh my gosh, what am I saying? This is really not okay. I'm so sorry. I need to go figure out what's going on with me, and I'll come back and have this conversation with you. A lot of the times, though, what happens, and this next part makes a lot of people uncomfortable, it feels good. We get a moment of release. And think about this whole cycle we've been talking about. So much buildup. So much powerlessness, out of control, emotional fuel that's gone into us getting to that point where we're shouting or yelling or self-harming, or we get a release from that. And it's short-lived, but it's there. So we have to think about, what are the things that reinforce the distortions? What are the things that make that behavior feel good? And really working at this point again of being accountable and bringing in the awareness. Because at this point, everything comes back to, we have to be accountable and make true acknowledgement of, I may not like your behavior, but my behavior has been very inappropriate and is taking me far out of my integrity of who I want to be. So I need to go take a look at that. And when we don't do that, then we feel all of the negative feelings again. And at this point, it's a lot of shame and guilt. What I like to call the clinical oh shits. Oh shit. What did I just say or do? Or who was just impacted? How is this going to affect me? Am I going to get in trouble? Am I feeling gross about myself? Do I feel shame about who I am? Do I feel guilt about what I've done? So these are pretty heavy things to be dealing with at this point. Again, working with some accountability, working with breaking some of those feelings down and managing them. Like, we got to do some triage, especially if shame is involved. We really need to focus in on getting ourselves some support, not doing, we've done all of this by not reaching out. So we need some kind of support, our resources, resiliencies to help pull us out of that. So just even being accountable to anyone at this point, even if it's not the person or situation. And if we don't do that, then we come to reframing. So our brain is a beautiful mechanism. It doesn't want us to suffer. And so we start to reframe it. We start to justify, we start to minimize, we start to externalize again how we got there and why it's not so bad, or why that was just a really bad day and we don't need to take accountability because that'll be more awkward. There's a lot of different ways that this can show up for people. So when we still don't take accountability, when we still don't say, wait, what am I telling myself? This is crazy. I need to take a step back here. Again, go get some assistance. Check this out with someone else. Hey, I think I did this thing and I really need help figuring it out. When we don't do that, then we are setting ourselves up for another cycle. And if people are kind of skipping through parts of this, it just means it's really well rehearsed and really well conditioned. So I encourage you to take this and look at it for yourself, work with it. However you are working in the world, it can work anywhere. And really try to help yourself understand this process before you start applying it to other people. It's very easy to do Monday morning therapist quarterbacking of ooh, and this person does this and that person does this.